I don't understand why this is laid at the door of the prince with so much castigation and so much blame.
There seems to be an emerging consensus that Prince Andrew's judgment about people is not the greatest.
It has promoted, or at least it has given voice to, anti-vaccine conspiracies, for example, stating that COVID was an engineered weapon.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagents live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester the following week on the 24th. And finally, the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates. The link will be in the description below. And we're very excited to see you there.
Have you been in contact with Buckingham Palace and Prince Andrew about this matter? And are we in Europe too easy on Chinese espionage?
Well, in relation to any discussions with Buckingham Palace, there's a long-standing convention in the United Kingdom that's never spoken about. Well,
I think the question was about Chinese espionage rather than Chinese spinach, which is what it slightly sounded like. But what you heard there was Keir Starmer playing the deadest of dead bats. But this is a formidable story about a Chinese spy, a member of the royal family, and the proximity to government and the British establishment.
And today, a High Court judge ruled that the Chinese spy could be named. We now know he's Yang Tengbo. He's a 50-year-old director of a Chinese investment consultancy firm and a likely threat to national security. But is he just the tip of the iceberg? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And it is a spy thriller out of something from Le Carré in a way. Because what you've got is you've got the royal family, you've got a Chinese spy, you've got this attempt at so-called elite capture where someone has infiltrated themselves into the heart of the British establishment. His phone, his devices get confiscated. There is a download of material. It contains all sorts of letters and emails that have been sent that show how he was trying to get in and out of Buckingham Palace or various other palaces along the way without detection.
Yeah, and what we know at the moment is this 50-something-year-old Chinese national who'd managed to divide his time more recently between China and the UK as a businessman is alleged by MI5 to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party working for, and this is my favourite bit because there's always a name of a body that sounds so boring that nobody looks twice at it. He works for the United Front Work Department, which sounds like a nothing organisation until you peep below the surface. And what does it do? It gathers intelligence on behalf of the Chinese state. And incredibly, the UK Security Service actually stopped this man in November 2021 as he's coming through the airport. They take his phone, they detain him under counter-terrorism laws, and suddenly they're downloading the stuff on his phone, messages, emails, and find this absolute humdinger of an email from Private Secretary of Prince Andrew saying, please understand you are very close to the top of the tree for a senior member of the royal family. You are welcome. You are...
And also this other thing that is that thanks to your advice, we managed to get you in and out of various palaces without detection. Yeah. And so, again, you know, this was someone who had got himself inside the heart of the British establishment, the heart of the royal family. And that is kind of some achievement on the part of the Chinese. Of course, the Chinese are saying it's all nonsense. It's a smear on this particular person's name.
It's obviously very embarrassing for Buckingham Palace, and obviously Prince Andrew has already got a deeply anomalous role within the royal family right now, sort of in but not in at the same time. And it's not exactly known when the Duke of York and this person who, for the time being, we've all had to refer to as H6 rather than their actual name. It does sound like a pencil, particularly blunt, dull pencil. And they... No, that's Andrew.
Mind work. It's really makes me think of
an
a bomb.
HB pencil.
Yeah. An atom bomb.
I thought pencil as well. I'm with
Lewis and I are pencils.
Curious.
But it's not known exactly when H6 and the Duke met. But Andrew put out a statement on Friday saying the pair met through, quote, official channels. And it's believed, so it's been reported, that they grew so close that H6 was invited to Andrew's birthday party in 2020, visited Buckingham Palace twice, also entered St James's Palace and Windsor Castle at the personal invitation of the Duke. That's according to reporting from the Times newspaper. And H6 was also told by Andrew's aide, Dominic Hampshire, that he could act on the Duke's behalf when dealing with potential investors in China. So, obviously, this has all taken place, of course, as well, by the way, after the point at which Andrew has rather fallen from grace within the royal family. But nonetheless, the Chinese Communist Party still using him as a conduit to gain access, who knows what sort of intelligence about the British establishment more generally, but it has got to a point now where it has generated a lot of controversy, particularly from MPs, people like Ian Duncan Smith saying today, who's a long-standing China hawk, saying that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of Chinese infiltration.
Look, I think Prince Andrew does have a habit of inviting quite unsavoury characters to his birthday parties. We've seen this in the past.
And to do interviews with him.
But I also think that I'm slightly struggling here. Maybe that will surprise people. But I don't understand why this is laid at the door of the prince with so much castigation and so much blame. We know that H6, your pencil man, met British Prime Ministers, met Theresa May, met David Cameron, met Brandon Lewis. They've all distanced themselves very cleverly and very quickly from him and said, well, we meet lots of people, he was in the room. And I do understand that there was probably, sounds as if there was a business relationship between the Prince and H6 at a time when, let's be honest, we know the Prince has been struggling with his financial affairs. But I don't understand why, if Andrew didn't know that this man was a spy, and there is absolutely nothing to suggest that he knew this man was a spy.
Well, if he's a good spy, he doesn't tell people.
There you go. And nobody else did, is what I'm saying. It's not like Andrew carried on a relationship,
Andrew
having
was
been warned.
in, having a relationship or whatever,
That's what royals do. He was a former envoy. He was sent out into the world to do these slightly weird, maybe possibly nefarious deals, maybe on behalf of the state for a decade when he was the envoy. And so I think if he's guilty of something, it's definitely naivety. And great that all our politicians remove themselves. But when I read all this stuff about, he's not allowed to walk to church, or he's not allowed to be with the royal family, or he's not allowed to be with the sort of the rest of the gang, I kind of think, well, I don't understand what the actual crime is here, frankly.
Yeah.
Well,
I just don't.
I suppose that, we don't actually have more information about other dealings that he may have had, but it is clear that being told that you could act on the Duke's behalf, it's not just meeting people like with Theresa May or David Cameron, right? There does seem to be an extra layer of connection that exists. And I suppose it speaks to what you just said, Emily, which is that it speaks to his unusual position within the royal family, right? Yeah. He has been, he's sort of cut off. The king has stopped paying for a lot of the things that the Queen paid for. And
And was right at the heart, weirdly, of what Tony Blair was asking him to do a decade earlier as this kind of, the time he was Air Miles Andy, as this business envoy.
But I suppose that's the idea. So obviously there's a royal problem, which Buckingham Palace is now going to have to manage. Maybe that has repercussions for Andrew. But of course, the more significant thing, particularly for our purposes, is the political dimension to it, right? Which is that now you have got that there is a problem in particular for Keir Starmer's government that this gets to the heart of, which is that it is very clear, and has been clear for some months now, that Starmer's government has been attempting to thaw relations between China and the UK, primarily, presumably, for economic reasons, right? We know Rachel Reeves is going to be visiting in the new year. Ed Miliband is going to be visiting in the new year. Keir Starmer has met with President Xi, the first British Prime Minister to do so for 7 years. We are desperate, and that government is desperate for Chinese investment. And every time there is a story like this, it makes that pivot that much harder, particularly if they are seen, which I suspect they will be today, seen to be trying to play down any prospect or any suggestion of significant Chinese infiltration, because there are lots of critics of the Chinese Communist Party, primarily on the conservative benches, but not exclusively, who will be pushing this day after day now. People like Ian Duncan Smith, someone like Tom Tugendhat, because they are and have been for a long time, warning about Chinese infiltration, not just in politics, but in all aspects of British cultural life, universities and so on.
And it's perfectly possible that both are right, in the sense that, is there an increased risk from China, from cybersecurity threats, from the activity of their agents abroad? Yeah, absolutely, there is an increased threat. Is it important that Britain has better relations with China? Probably also tick. That's also right. And so you've got the balance between the two of them. On the one hand, of wanting to keep your country, for national security reasons, safe and free from Chinese kind of, bad actors. Although I'm sure that MI6 has agents in China that are trying to infiltrate the government of Beijing. That's what we do. Yeah. And that's what's done on both sides.
And it was ever thus.
And it was ever thus.
This is not going to be the first Chinese spy, and it's not going to be the last Chinese spy. And Keir Starmer knows very well that China's unique position is somewhere that you absolutely fear and dread and want to hold to account and do business with.
But it is an autocratic regime with a terrible human rights record.
As most of them are.
Yeah, but look at something
increasingly.
But look at someone like Jimmy Lai. And I was interviewing Chris Patton yesterday on the LBC show, absolutely making the point that, look, this is a guy, a British national, who has been held for 1,000 days. He's a Catholic, not allowed to take Holy Communion. He's in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, as a prisoner, basically, of the Chinese Communist Party. Is the British government, Keir Starmer, David Lammy, said anything about it? No. And that is where the tension comes in. And of course, you have to deal with autocratic.
And we still dealt with Putin,
relationship with Saudi Arabia.
And look where that got us with Putin. I mean, yes, we tried to cozy up to him, and look what happened.
But the difference you've got in him, if you've got MI5 and MI6 built largely on the threats posed by the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union and the Free West, it doesn't work with China. Because with the Soviet Union, with the Warsaw Pact countries, there wasn't that much trade at the best of times. They didn't have much that we wanted to import. Did we want to have Lada cars? Not really. Did we want to have trabbies? Not so much.
Speak for yourself. I love a trabbie.
Well, okay, good for you.
And beluga caviar.
Yeah, exactly. Beluga caviar, maybe. That would have done well at Harrods, but not much else. So there wasn't a huge volume of trade going between East and West during the Cold War era. There is a phenomenal amount of trade.
China's nailed it.
China's nailed it. It is absolutely integral to the world capitalist free market system, an exchange of goods. So therefore, you damage relations and relationships at your peril, because China is such a vital economic player.
But that's also why the hawks are saying, and have said for a long time, that we need to start divesting ourselves of Chinese supply chains. And that might be difficult, but when you're dealing with a regime which is despotic, which is economically nationalist, and not afraid to use that economic nationalism to try and get what it wants, then you can see why that might be a good idea.
Lithuania is the role model here. Lithuania decided very early on they weren't going to deal with China, they were going to deal with Taiwan. They now have the Taiwan semiconductor factories being built in Lithuania. They've basically done a complete pivot, and it's worked. But they are a small enough country, in essence, to work on a one-on-one basis with Taiwan and say, screw you. And I don't think many other countries are in that place.
I mean, we're moving away from the Chinese spy story, but it is going to be fascinating. If Trump imposes massive tariffs on China and on the European Union when he becomes president, which way does Britain jump? Does Britain kind of start acting with Europe and China against America, and then it becomes sort of the rest of the world versus the US? Or do we say, OK, no, Donald, we're with you on this, you're absolutely right?
That's what we'll do. It was like Huawei.
Well, hold that thought, because we're going to hear now from a former Director of Operations and Intelligence for MI6, a man who has been right at the cusp of some of the extraordinary decisions and intelligence that this kind of scenario throws up. His name is Nigel Inkster, and he's a China specialist.
Nigel, so with Prince Andrew, what exactly has he done wrong?
Well, I think it's rather unfortunate. I think there seems to be an emerging consensus that Prince Andrew's judgment about people is not the greatest. And of course, this case developed at a time when Prince Andrew was under significant financial pressure, having been effectively cut off from the finances of the royal household. In a sense, I don't think you can say he's done anything wrong as such, but certainly I think one would have to say he's guilty of naivety and poor judgment, neither of which is a criminal offence.
But isn't it for somebody else to warn him that he shouldn't be bringing people like that into the palace? I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, if nobody knew this man was a spy, if nobody knew his intentions, it wasn't like a Jeffrey Epstein case. It wasn't like, you've been hanging around with people that the world knows about well. Why has that, why has it sort of turned on him now?
This speaks, I think, to the difficulties of dealing with this kind of case, because at bottom, when is a business deal not just a business deal?
Yeah.
That can be a very difficult thing to ascertain. If the individual concerned, H6, as we have to refer to him, was engaging in genuine business activities, then the nefarious intent beneath that may well have taken time to appreciate and to emerge. I don't know what the timings exactly are. I don't know who knew what when, who told what when. And it has clearly taken a certain amount of time for the security services to put together the case that was presented at SIAC the other week.
Nigel Inkster, thank you so much for being with us. Really interesting. In a moment, we will be back with a different sort of podcast and what it is doing in terms of spreading apparently false information about health.
So there was a story which broke on Friday, an investigation from the BBC World Service which caught our eye. And it's a really interesting one. And this is about a different podcast. It's about Stephen Bartlett's very popular Diary of a CEO podcast. And he's been accused in this investigation of amplifying health information to millions and millions of people. Basically, guests coming on and making false claims, misinformation, which he as the host does not challenge. So, for example, they say that on his show it has promoted, or at least it has given voice to, anti-vaccine conspiracies, for example stating that COVID was an engineered weapon, said that polycystic ovarian syndrome or autism and other disorders can be reversed with diet, that evidence-based medication is toxic for patients, and among other things that, for example, cancer can be treated by following a keto diet rather than proven treatment. Now, needless to say, there is very little to no scientific evidence for any of these things, but they have been, as a result of being on the show, which is extremely, extremely popular, put into the ears of millions and millions of people.
And of course, we discussed this on the podcast last week in the context of milk, that there were people being terrified now because of a product that was designed to make cows belch less, could be dangerous, and it was woke milk. And you are finding that on the internet, in new media, there is this kind of focus on wellness. And wellness doesn't mean just being well. It means finding alternatives to the conventional ways of treating things. And science seems to go out of the window. And if you go back a few years, I mean, the MMR vaccine and whether it caused autism.
20 years.
20 years, yeah. But it caused a huge downturn in the number of people having MMR jabs and an uptick in people getting all sorts of diseases like measles.
We're paying for it now.
And we're paying the price for it now.
Exactly, the sort of 20-year cycle, lots of young adults getting measles.
And potentially this is now very much back in fashion, of course, because potentially the new health secretary in the US is a vaccine skeptic himself. And Stephen Bartlett, we should say, has done nothing wrong in terms of breach of any rules in allowing these people to come on his show and spout. Now, you could argue that there is an editorial, an ethical and moral argument which says you should put the evidence to them. But in terms of regulation, the podcast space is a free space.
Which includes us.
Which includes us. And he has used it and invited guests on and given them a platform, which is a word I hate normally, because I think that when people come and be interviewed on this show, we kind of give them an interview and not just say, is there anything you'd like to tell a grateful nation? But it seems the charge against Diary of a CEO is that it has been used too much just to spout things which are scientifically untrue.
I think where this gets interesting is in the whole space that is now called men's health, men's mental health. And in a sense, it's become a reaction to people spending a lot of time talking about, women's health. We're talking about women, we're talking about the vulnerability of women, we're talking about sort of women at a disadvantage to men. And there has been something of a backlash. And the backlash started, I think, with absolutely the right intentions, which is, well, do you know how vulnerable some young men are feeling? Do you know how vulnerable some of our sort of emerging sort of, do you know how difficult it is for young men to emerge into a world where the rules are changed and all this kind of stuff? But I think what we've seen in the last few years is it metastasizing into those characters who more traditionally champion traditional masculinity. And they are what we would now, I think, call the bros. Russell Brand, Jordan Peterson, the people who are trying to harness health-conscious individuals and say, make sure that you're not being put at a disadvantage by these women. Make sure that you're not being forgotten. Make sure that you can stand on your own 2 feet. And a lot of the language, I think, now becomes quite sort of aggressively misogynist. Now, I'm not saying that Steve Bartlett is, I'm not saying that the guests on his show are, but I think it is part of a growing trend, which we're all recognising now, which is the language of, have men forgotten how to be men? Do they have to reclaim that masculine territory and remind people that, rules are rules and sexes are sexes and we're not going to be bossed around?
Yeah, I think that it is, as John was saying, it is very, very interesting that the sort of online wellness space has, in a way that I certainly kind of didn't see coming, been captured by quite sort of alt-right kind of forces and voices in a way that wouldn't necessarily kind of flow. You could easily imagine it being a sort of slightly more left, kind of hippie-ish, kind of spiritual kind of thing. You probably would have seen more in the 60s and 70s. But just specifically on what is happening here, which I think is a symptom of a wider problem, which is just going to come up again and again and again and more and more and more, which is that we know, I mean, we're beneficiaries of it, right? Like the sort of new media space is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and shows like Bartlett's show or Joe Rogan in the US, a lot of discussion about that in the election, they can be bigger and have bigger audiences and be more influential than regulated traditional TV radio shows. And that is a trend which is likely to get bigger and bigger. On this show, like if someone was to come, we're not regulated either, but if someone was to come on that show and make those claims, we still try to do what we've always done as journalists, right? As if we were in a regulated space where we'd say, hang on a minute, what's your evidence for that? And
we hopefully always give people a right of reply.
Yeah.
I mean, as we have done to Steve Bartlett, I think, today.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a problem, I think, and in a way, as I say, it's much bigger than Bartlett than this thing. But it is, I think, a problem which is going to come up more and more and more, which is that what is the long-term justification for having these spaces completely unregulated by, say, Ofcom, apart from the fact that it is quite difficult to regulate for different reasons we could get into, when the exact reasons that you would regulate them are the same as you would for radio and TV, which is you're trying to stop the spread of misinformation, you're trying to stop people making claims which could be damaging. I mean, in this case, for example, one of the doctors in that investigation, specifically on the claim of the idea that keto could help stop your cancer, as one of the doctors said, you could potentially, this is a quote from the doctor, you could potentially and very realistically get very, very sick and have a much worse health outcome if you did that, rather than following recommended advice from your oncologist. So if you've got cancer, you hear that and you do that, actually could make you more ill.
And of course, it goes into that space that you were describing about alt-right, of Elon Musk land, of the right of free speech. We're defending the right of free speech by allowing people to come on and say these things unchallenged. Well, no, you're not. I mean, yeah, in the kind of loosest possible way, it's free speech that we can say whatever we like. But when you've got a big audience, which Stephen Bartlett has, and he's claiming that, his podcast could make 20 million quid this year in profit, which is a huge sum of money for a single podcast to make, then realistically, you do have a responsibility as well as the right to free speech.
Look, I think you've hit on something here, which is the financial heft of these podcasts. I mean, I'm taking us out of this for a moment, but they are used to sell products quite often. You look at real Alex Jones, the InfoWars man who has been successfully sued by the parents of Sandy Hook for pretending or for trying to claim that the children there weren't murdered in the most horrific way, that it was just state actors. He has gone on selling supplements on his podcast. That is where his money comes from. You look at Steve Bartlett, right? Sells Huel. I like Huel. I drink Huel. But he is selling Huel on his podcast. These often provide platforms for something much, much bigger than conversation, which is an incredible financial offering, right? And so every time you come across somebody and say, oh, well, what's going on here? Is it about freedom of speech, or are you just trying to flog stuff? And Lewis, you're right. The whole kind of slightly, hippie, wacky, yogic stuff that used to belong to the left when we were kind of growing up,
Woodstock generation,
exactly, Crystals and California and all the rest of it has been taken over precisely, I think, because it is so lucrative. You get people who are vulnerable, who are looking for direction, who aren't, they're not going to church, they're not finding God, they're not doing all that stuff anymore. They are actually trying to work out how to live their lives, and the self-help industry is massive, right?
In a way, I mean, the thing is that, as we've said repeatedly, Bartlett has actually got he's got a moral responsibility, you're right, John, and an editorial one, we would argue, but he's not done anything against any the rules. Absolutely. Because there are no rules really, apart from the law. And I would just say that I just think increasingly, and I feel that you feel this almost month by month, Britain's online and political regulation as it exists is basically now just proving to be so antiquated. Antiquated. 100%. And no politician seems willing to actually ask and grapple with this and actually ask tough questions. It goes back to, in a way, again, exactly the same thing with Elon Musk. I mean, the fact that conversation we've had about Musk and the idea that he, maybe he gives 100 million to reform, maybe he gives 40 million. Nick Candy, their new treasurer, is apparently going over to see Musk and again, maybe potentially ask for some money, or at least sort of suggest that might be a good idea. I mean, the fact is, our electoral law and online law are both so antiquated. They come together in that story because basically the electoral law is such is that if Musk wanted to, he could make the donation via a UK subsidiary, clearly against the kind of spirit of the laws. And although there is a spending limit in terms of general election spending, and you can't pay for TV and radio advertising, you can do what you want online. You can pay.
The spirit of the laws is such a good phrase, isn't it? Because actually, once you've said, well, I'm not adhering to the spirit, you've basically got carte blanche to do what you want.
Exactly. And you can do whatever you want in terms of political advertising. Pretty much, it is an unregulated Wild West. And honestly, I get no sense of urgency from the government or any deep thinking about these issues. And someone needs to, because it is going to become more and more acute over time.
And to go back to Emily's point, that this is so easy to monetize. That if you have got people who are not sure about information now and want to believe certain things, that there is a growing market now to doubt conventional wisdom. Completely. And, this guy is saying something really amazing about diet and how that can cure your cancer, or this is going to get rid of your diabetes and you'll no longer need insulin, or whatever it happens to be.
Aren't we, to believe in something now,
desperate
right?
to believe in it. And you can find susceptible people. And so as opposed to the snake oil salesman of old who used to turn up in a small western town in the United States of America and say, I'm going to cure you, we've now got it online with people handing over large wads of money to find this, and it's increasing the profitability of various different podcasts around the world who are cashing in on it.
Should say that Bartlett's production company, Flight Studio, issued a statement about this on Friday, and they said the Diary of a CEO is an open-minded, long-form conversation with individuals identified for their distinguished and eminent career and/or consequential life experiences. They heard a range of voices, not just those of Stephen and the Diary of a CEO team necessarily agree with. So they're saying it's just part of an open conversation.
We'll be back after this. And just a reminder to send us your what ifs, which is going to be our Christmas offering to you, dear listener. We're going to do 4 episodes of what ifs, hypothetical scenarios. If Emily Maitlis hadn't turned up for work today, what would the newsagents have been like? Dull.
Terrible,
boring.
She always does, because she's
much higher intellectual heft than had ever been heard before.
Exactly. Yeah. But if on kind of global events of the last, 30 or so years, what would have been different if things had gone in a different direction. Those sliding doors moments of history.
Please, no one else suggest what if David Miliband had won against Ed Miliband. We've had about 500 of those, so
You
be a
are
little bit
obsessing
more
about those
imaginative.
Miliband brothers still.
What if
What?
Britain hadn't left the European Union? We've had a lot of those as well.
Yeah, well, the answer would be we'd still be in the European Union. Next.
Well, Lewis, if you're going to kill every episode like that, well, then we haven't got an episode.
Someone said, what would happen if Princess Diana hadn't been killed?
Should have
been alive. Next. There we go.
They're very quick episodes. You won't waste your time on these.
No. They're going to be great. But keep
We'll see
sending
you
them to
tomorrow.
newsagents@global.com.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.